Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. Questions for tonight's lecture will be only be taken through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can put questions there at any time, and I'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the course of the lecture and grouping them and delivering them to the lecturer at the end of the talk. It's my pleasure to welcome Jeff Day to the University of Tennessee, whatever that means, since he is sitting in Omaha tonight. Jeff is a dual threat architect with impressive accomplishments in both academia and practice. A graduate of Harvard College and the University of California, Berkeley, he is the Killinger Professor of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he led the Department of Architecture for 5 years. At Nebraska, Jeff founded and leads FACT, the Fabrication and Construction Team, which is described as an academic professional collaborative design lab exploring the complex relationships between thinking and making. On the national stage, he is an at-large director on the board of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. Jeff is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and the founding principal in 2018 of Actual Architecture Company. For 15 years previous, he served as a founding principal of Min-Day. Between these two celebrated practices, Jeff has received some of the profession's most significant accolades. These include selection as a member of Architectural Records Design Vanguard and as an emerging voice by the Architectural League of New York. His design awards are too numerous to list here, but include several ACSA Faculty Design Awards, AIA Central States Region Awards, and just recently a Progressive Architecture Award. Jeff, in lieu of the warm applause you would normally be hearing right now, I'm very glad to offer my sincere welcome to the Church Memorial Lecture Series.
Thanks so much, Ted. I'm really pleased to be there. I'm here in Omaha and teaching semi-remotely, like everybody else, trying to find a way to get by in this sort of situation that we all find ourselves in. Really disappointed I can't be there with you in person. I've never visited your school in person. I've been through the city before, but I was really looking forward to this, and well, here we are. But I'm glad that we're able to do at least this remote version of a talk. So I'm going to jump right in here, share my screen. It'll take me a couple seconds to get this going. And we will start with, well, as Ted mentioned, I run Actual Architecture Company. In fact, formerly Min-Day was the firm I ran with my partner, E.B. Min, and many of the projects I'm going to show tonight originated with Min-Day. Some sort of started with Min-Day and finished under Actual Architecture. And then FACT is the design build program that I started around the time that I began teaching almost 20 years ago, probably 18 years ago for FACT itself. And it's sort of a hybrid design build, professional, semi-professional organization. We take on a variety of different projects under a range of different organizational sort of regimes. And I'll be showing some of those projects as well. But just to jump in, the framework of this lecture is this word witchcraft, spelled correctly on the screen here. At some point in the design of every project, a designer has to ask herself, which form of craft does this project demand? How do we make these decisions? Are we in control, or are we ruled by external forces such as economy, risk, available technology, building standards, or broader cultural forces? So in this talk, I'm going to contemplate these questions through a variety of projects from the office and FACT, and try to elucidate a few of the ways that we think about these issues in our work. And a note on the title, witchcraft is actually a term coined by the artist Jim Woodfill, with whom we work numerous times, and also Josh Shelton of El Dorado. And I think most of you probably know Josh is a graduate of your school and currently a member of the Dean's Advisory Board. But they used to have conversations, which I participated in on occasion, talking about how one in architecture starts to make choices about craft and the issues that we deal with when we're thinking about this idea of craft. So the term craftsman or craftsperson and craftsman is really the origin of this issue, and it certainly has its sort of gendered characteristics and stereotypes, but it does bring up sort of stereotypical images, often of an old man, such as in this image, in a workshop using manual tools to make something. The sociologist Richard Sennett writes that craftsmanship is the skill of making things well, and that the craftsman is anyone dedicated to good work for its own sake. So while practical, craftsmanship is not simply a means to an end. Craftsmanship is not limited to work with hand tools. One can embody craftsmanship in a variety of fields and through a variety of technologies. And by common measure, it takes about 10,000 hours of practice, patience, and experience to become a master craftsman. No matter what the field or tool, woodcarver, musician, experimental scientist, or computer programmer, there's an amount of time that one must put in before one can start to tackle broader questions and new problems without the limitations of skill getting in the way. Sennett talks at length about open source computer programming, and in particular the Linux computer language as a subfield in which programmers work for the desire to make an elegant code in and of itself. In this context, quality is not dependent on quality is dependent on an effective community of software engineers and coders working together with the shared goal of bettering the software. The combination of craft and community is very critical, and it's something I'm going to return to at the end of the talk. So in all eras, craftsmanship implies a particular relationship between the craftsperson and the tool, selecting the right tool for the job. This is more often an ad hoc, pragmatic exercise than an attempt at procedural purity, as craftsmanship focuses on the thing in itself, according to Sennett, not on the tool or the procedure. The thing made is its own justification. Richard Sennett defines craftsmanship as the basic human impulse to do a job well for its own sake. And thus we usually associate good craft with custom products and a high degree of refinement. But what may be understood as good quality varies with the context of the project. And this is an image of an early Min-Day project in Iowa, a custom home, which I think in many cases attempted to exert a kind of precise control over construction, over site, over material joints, products, and custom fabrications. Working with custom materials, custom color, impregnated materials, but also with standardized construction and trying to merge these within a highly controlled environment. This house actually has 6 bathrooms and each one is a different color. But to achieve this kind of controlled precision in contemporary practice takes a lot of architectural attention, specifically exhaustive detailing and documentation. In pre-modern architecture, a social relationship existed between the master builder and the craftsperson, and that obviated the need for documentation. The builder relied then on the tacit knowledge of building in any given medium with the craftspeople who worked on the site. But what may be understood as good quality varies with the context of the project itself. Finely crafted, but not necessarily fine material, could present some interesting ideas. Contrast of material quality, high and low. Here in this house, aspects of the project include materials such as oriented strand board, but the oriented strand board, cheap material from the hardware store used for sheathing, not usually used as a finished surface, except in this case, the idea of the reference of the sort of shack on the coast, understood here in a $3 million house, a little bit out of context maybe. But the material itself in this case was taken by a cabinet maker, refined, sanded, perfected, and turned into a sort of high degree of precision in the way it's installed as paneling and custom doors and so on. So one of the things that has interested us for a really long time in our practice is the idea of controlled imprecision, trying to understand where imprecision is and exists within the project and then framing that with areas of control in other aspects of the project. So here in the same house, working with parametric modeling to create, this was Maya, so it was before Grasshopper, to create this sort of textured, three-dimensionally crafted headboard for the main bed in the house. There's an interest here in the sort of contradictory friction of surface effects, where you get a very supple curvature of a sort of waveform running through layered stranded plywood, so that you're seeing the sort of horizontal strands and layers of the plywood that are interrupting the perfection of the sort of watery surface. So if fine craft then is a choice, what are the alternatives? And this brings up something that's been of interest for a number of years, but looking at paradigms of craft. And we get these terms from the field of manufacturing quality control, so outside of the realm of architecture. And examples include custom craft, which in manufacturing quality control refers to product specification relative to consumer demands, and paradigms of manufacturing, including mass production, mass customization, and the emerging paradigm of personalization, which exists primarily now in apparel design, where one can have shoes or clothing made to specific specifications, but without necessarily spending a tremendous amount of money. The techno-craft paradigm emulates custom craft, but is less expensive by the integration of computation and manufacture in customer sizing. So again, the sort of idea that you can have a shoe made with a specific color pattern that is unique to you, but it is not going to necessarily cost you very much more than the standard shoe from a mass production operation. So despite much experimentation with this sort of idea of algorithmic design and digital fabrication, the building industry is still generally rather traditional in its emphasis on customization, and that customization is expensive. So I first became aware of the importance of different craft paradigms in college when I occupied myself with set design and technical direction in college theatrical productions. So here, the visual resolution of stage details from the position of the audience, so an audience member could be 50 or 100 feet from the stage, depends on and requires an imprecision in the construction and detailing of scenery. Set painting needs to be exaggerated and somewhat crude in order to look correct to an audience member sitting at quite a distance from the scenery itself. Otherwise, the resolution starts to even out the surface, and textures and lighting effects start to disappear. So the expectations of stagecraft are clearly very different from the custom craft of fine cabinetry and woodworking that you might find in furniture. So again, different paradigms of craft can come together with different expectations and definition of quality, correctness, tolerance, and so on. Each paradigm has its own set of expectations and marks of quality. So here in the Eames House in Los Angeles, an assembled kit of parts where joints and fasteners are clearly articulated and the parts are always autonomous. One can always understand one part versus its adjacent neighbor. Or what we call farm craft exhibits a kind of expedience or pragmatism, but not necessarily aesthetic coherence. In many cases, aesthetics have nothing to do with farm craft. So here is a question of resolution and appropriate fitness to the task at hand. So in architecture, there's an interesting, architecture exists in a world related to craft, but has an interesting position relative to the overall discourse of making and crafting. We have a kind of craftsmanship in how we work, in our techniques, in the office, in the studio, in the model shop, or on the computer. But we also engage other craftspeople to realize our creations and our design work. It's rare to find an architect who actually builds their own work. We must select the category of craftsmanship that is not only appropriate to the practical task at hand, but also matched to our cultural expectations as represented in the project, in the design of the project specifically. And ideally, we see the implements of our work, or the implementers of our work as collaborators and not competitors. The historian Robin Evans writes that architects don't make buildings, they make drawings for buildings. But now with computational tools, the possibility of enacting a direct connection between the design process or design craft and the building process is achievable. Like technocraft in the field of manufacturing quality control, there is an attempt to merge the customization of traditional craft with the efficiency of mass production. However, a lack of coherence between design craft and building craft can still lead to unsatisfactory results. Here in an image from Artform magazine, a critique of Zaha Hadid's the Opera House in Guangzhou in China, which is designed computationally, a very sort of supple, formal building, but on close inspection of the details, you find that they're extremely crude and poorly resolved, where intersections are missing by feet at a time. And Richard Sennett refers to this as a conflict existing between getting something right and getting something done. And sometimes the desire to force perfection often misses the point of the actual resolution that will happen in the field. So here we see advanced digital design techniques, but a lack of understanding of the real world context of building in China at this particular time, the speed of construction, the methods, the skills of the builders, and the commitment of clients to follow through on very tricky, customly fabricated equipment and details. So often sophistication at one end of the process, at the design process in the office, must accommodate a lack of sophistication at the other end of the process on the site. And this may require a hybrid technique. Now, Rem Koolhaas recognized the limitations of this idea in OMA's early work and knowingly took advantage of these, or at least post-rationalized it this way, to argue that because there were no money, there was no details, and it's just architectural concept. So he did not care that things were not resolved right. That was potentially a self-serving argument, but nevertheless, it's an attempt to try to deal with that disconnect. But architects have long attempted experiments with available craft, pushing the limits as much as they can. Here at Harvard, the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts, Le Corbusier's only building in North America, experiments with cast-in-place concrete and attempts to both expose certain levels of joint and hide others, allowed Le Corbusier to push his work with reinforced concrete to new levels of perfection. So in an interest here in the tension of concrete behaving as it shouldn't, Le Corbusier forms a rough material into something that is almost purely abstract. On the adjacent building here by Renzo Piano from much more recent years, there's an attempt at a kind of mechanical craft and an emphasis on the direct assembly of parts. Many would say this is a more honest building because it seems to be expressing how it's built. But on close inspection, one can start to find that certain of these elements, like the large I-beam at the base, is actually not carrying any load. It's really just there as a stiffening element and isn't actually performing in the way that one might visually read. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to show a variety of projects from our office and the design build program, in fact, at various scales to try to articulate various relationships to craft. And this first project illustrates the conflict between getting something right and getting it done. This is an interior project in San Francisco, part of a showcase house where we were asked to build, to finish two rooms. I'm focusing on one in particular, where we built this cabinet that could convert from a desk to a bed. You couldn't have both, you had to make a choice, put your desk away in order to go to bed. So we began with the notion of sort of parametrically modeled project. This is our sort of first sort of foray into working with Grasshopper in the office to create this sort of diffuse pattern of holes. As you can see, the sort of holes change size. Some of them go through the panels, some of them don't. And the original version of the model had this sort of infinite variety of holes from a defined maximum and a defined minimum. But we later found out that what this meant in terms of machine time, when we're not working on a machine in the basement of our college, we're working with a fabricator who charges $120 an hour, machine time starts to become a real factor. So routing all of those holes would take a significant amount of time. And instead, we decided to optimize the project for 5 discrete hole sizes. So there's only 5 different diameters as opposed to an infinite variety. And that allowed them to work with pre-existing drill bits as opposed to routing ends. to sort of drill the holes in one shot each, which cut about 80% of the machine time, and obviously quite a lot of money. So as a design process, you can start to see the colors indicating the different hole patterns. It's just a variation on the same original script. But in the end, I think the casual visitor would probably understand this as fairly close to what we originally intended. But in order to get to this, one really has to understand the pragmatics of making as opposed to the ideals of a potentially complex project. For the same project, we designed a furniture piece called the Soft Stones, which was the origin of a furniture program, a furniture line that Min Day started and still kind of exists, called Mod. For this project, we created a coffee table that split from a sort of singular, sort of rectangular block into 6 separate and completely unique shapes. So as you can see, the shapes all have discrete clarity to their form, but each one is very unique and fits only to its adjacent neighbor. And here we have a combination of machine cut surface, cut on a CNC router, and hand finished ends made by hand. So this project, although we manufacture this piece and it's been sold several times, the top is always the same, the bottom always varies in a subtle way. At the Bucktown House in Chicago, we've also designed numerous furniture pieces, but here we took the notion of custom-made furniture and expanded that to become architectural elements in a sort of a project that really is based entirely around an elaborate millwork system. In this case, a bar sort of emerges at the push of a button. We used a television lift and just inverted it, and it lowers the bar. I suppose you could lock that so the kids can't get in there, but sort of impresses the neighbors. But again, applying the craft of the furniture maker to architecture and working with people who are able to translate that scale difference when it meets, when say the woodwork, which is crafted in the shop, meets the plastering, which is finished on site. Something that occurs in many of our projects with little surprise moments. We've done several projects that have sort of workspaces like this that can be put away simply by just shutting doors and locking those away. But this project, it's actually a 4,000 square foot house. We didn't design the house. We only did interior work and exterior decks that extend that experience of the house out into the landscape in the middle of Chicago. The next series of projects I'm going to talk about are at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts in Omaha. And the image behind me here in the Zoom image is actually one of these projects in the Bemis Center, which is down the street from our office in the Old Market in Omaha. The Bemis Center has been around for almost 40 years. It's an art residency program, internationally known. And its goal is to close the gap between spaces of production and spaces of consumption of art. So it's a place where artists work. It's also a place where the public can experience that work in gallery spaces and performance venues, and also engage with the artists. But the primary mission of the Bemis is supporting artists. And the building itself, it's actually 2 buildings. There's one across the street, and this larger building called the McCord-Brady is literally used as a work site for artists, where artists will do installations that become either permanent or temporary modifications of the building, which is still inhabited by staff, visitors, and resident artists. So FACT actually began with a master plan for the Bemis Center that's evolved over time and over the years. And later we've added numerous projects and expanded the master plan and actually implemented several of these through different design build studios. So the garden on the exterior, the rainwater catchment idea that didn't get materialized, but the garden is there. On the 3rd floor, we added a whole level of studios plus workspace and installation space for the artists. On the main floor, we reconceived the gallery spaces, reorganized those, and created a cinema and a new reception area that I'll get to in a moment. And then currently we're working on a venue and facilities for a new sound art and experimental music program that the Bemis runs to bring artists working in sound and music, giving them place to work. So we have a recording studio and sort of support areas, and then a performance venue where they can perform their works. But the first project that was actually built is called the Bemis Soft Cube. This was in the summer of 2008. We were asked to create a sort of transformation of a gallery space in this old warehouse building to allow lectures and other kinds of live events to be performed in what is sort of generally sort of thought of as the White Cube Art Gallery. We had, since the day we were asked to do this, we had 6 weeks to complete the whole project and about a $1,500 budget. Obviously, that's not a lot of money when you start talking about construction and custom fabrication. But we designed as an acoustical baffle this 40-foot wall, 12 feet tall, as a simple sort of intersection of curved geometries and then a sort of complex sort of hyper surface that wraps over that to create a diffuser for sound, but then resolves itself as a bench at the base for visitors and others to enjoy the show on the other side of the room. The entire piece is built out of cheap CDX plywood, CNC cut and notched to join, and then wrapped with homosoap strips. Construction here, as you can see, bolting these sections together on top of this base, and then in the end, the final piece. This was intended to be installed and used for the duration of this exhibition for 3 months and then taken away and stored. But they've kept it up since that time, and so it's been in place and used for about 12 years and still going strong. The only issue is that when they told us they wanted to keep the piece installed, we had to tell them that we made no way, we incorporated no way to change the light bulbs in the back because we assumed that these fluorescent tubes would survive the 3-month run of the show. So we had to modify the piece somewhat so that there was access in the back, but other than that, it's maintained its position in the gallery. And as you can see in use, it's used for a variety of different kinds of performance events and lectures as well. And it's part of a goal that we've had working with the Bemis to transform the gallery into a place of social engagement, not simply a place of display and consumption of visual materials. But we really think of the Arts Center as a social condenser that brings the community and the artists together. So the next sort of major project we call the Info Shop, after the sort of notion of the anarchist info shop, where information is shared freely. This is really a version of a reception area, which oddly enough, the Bemis did not have. One would enter the doors, as you can see here, towards the in front of the stairs, and you'd be right in the galleries. It was really set up as a sort of temporary art site in a sense, not a functioning sort of museum-like space. But by taking the first bay of the gallery away and creating a space that doesn't have art displayed, we created a social environment, practically used as a reception desk, but that could be converted in the evening for a bar to serve drinks and so on during an opening event. So this is a project that actually began in the office. We did schematic design in the office and then brought the schematic design to the students so that the students, in fact, would jump immediately into design development and focus on details and not be concerned with initial sort of conceptualization. The argument I have in the FACT studio and coursework that supports FACT is that most architectural education exists in a world where we are conceiving projects and taking them through maybe schematic design or some level of resolution of that nature. And the idea with FACT is to sort of go and explore the creative opportunities from design development through construction, where, as any architect knows, there's still a lot of things to be thought about. So the project, as you can see, is a sort of abstraction of a white gallery space, but distorted and then occupied with furniture, which is a soft stone. It's called the soft stones. It's a version of the Stones table, and turned into a sort of puzzle-like seating, and then this 24-foot long reception desk. The geometries that we used are based on a pinwheel aperiodic tiling pattern. This is a fractal pattern that through very simple rules using sort of scalar versions of the same shape produce exceptional complexity. As you can see, each triangle can be subdivided into 5 more, and scaling up and down through that allows us to create a very complex set of patterns. So we took this pattern abstractly, it's scaleless, and then selected an area of that to scale to the beam center space. So you can see the dotted lines there representing the 2 wall surfaces. The red lines then became points of inflection from a very large triangle that doesn't even fit the space. And the smaller pieces are scaled to 8 feet, half of a sheet of MDF, so that we had a very efficient use of material. And then from there, imposed patterns upon the surface. Now, obviously, this pattern could be implemented at any level of scale. So we had to make decisions about where it shows its density and where it starts to sort of soften and loosen. And so using an algorithm based on these sort of primary inflection points where the major triangles or vertices are coming together, we were able to control the diffusion of the pattern and its scalar nature across the surface. So this is a photograph of the finished piece, and you can see the large joints are actually joints between panels. The second scale joint are inscribed in the surface, and then the pocketing brings 2 levels of panel triangle inside the others. So the other issue here is trying to turn this 2-dimensional pattern into 3 dimensions where some distortion is necessary. And as you can see here, the pattern's both bent as we sort of create the corner in the room and inflected along those red lines. And then the desk is actually an extrapolation of that pattern into a fully 3-dimensional sculptural object that sits in the space. As you can see here, the vertice of the wall, you can see how that traces across the surface of the desk. The inherent perfection of this piece obviously could be taken to extreme lengths. I think the students did an incredible job of fabricating this and installing it, allowing its abstraction to read through. But they had to do this in a building where between each bay of the 16-foot column grid, the floor might vary 2 inches. So we're dealing here with a very complex sort of intersection of fabrication at a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch and a building that has extremely low tolerance. And so bringing those together created some interesting challenges. Another challenge for this group was, of course, that we had to mill 35 sheets of MDF. And one of the issues one of my sort of priorities with design build is to really optimize the educational experience and not just turn it into an opportunity for exploiting free labor. And I couldn't imagine students standing by a CNC router for the whole semester while each of these sheets gets cut and pocketed. So we did mock-ups and tests on our own, and then started to search for a partner who could build it. And we found this machine in Lincoln. It just happened to be in a medium security prison shop. And we partnered with the prison and inmates in a workplace training program to do the fabrication for us. And so the inmates, I can't show their pictures, it's not legal, so I'm using these guys to stand in for our partners in the prison. Did a tremendous amount of work for us. The students did the coding for the CNC routers and then transmitted that code into the prison where the inmates built the components. They were then shipped to the site and the students did installation from numbered parts. So here, this collision of high tolerance digital fabrication with a very rough historic building, and what some people call the site joint, the point where the building meets the site is never as controlled as the building itself, becomes an opportunity for thinking about how these kind of tolerances start to collide and create opportunities. So the way the wall meets the window, it's not perfect, but it starts to show the intersection of these different levels of understanding of tolerance. Fortunately, nowadays, they've gotten rid of the video monitors and they're no longer mounted on the face of the wall, which is not something we were too excited about. This image shows the sort of level of fabrication one of the things that had to be resolved was how these very precise panels get attached to the building. So we had to build our own studs using CNC shaped studs to control the shape, and then infilling that with custom gusset plates and standard stud framing to get within a relatively high degree of tolerance, and then using the 1/4 inch joint between panels as a bit of slop between that, allowing the panels to float above the floor, which the reveal at the floor ranges from about 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. And then, resolving that in the space. The garden, I'm not going to show today, but the garden is sort of a further extrapolation of some of those geometries out onto what used to be a loading dock and was planted with native plants of various kinds, working with the landscape architecture department and students from that program. The current project, though, the experimental music and sound art program, the first phase of this was completed at the beginning of this year. It's called Bemis Low End, and it's a performance space. We had maybe 3 performances in there before COVID, and everything is shut down. The Bemis still runs virtual performances, sometimes in the space, sometimes wherever the artists happen to be located. And obviously, we're waiting for the pandemic to resolve before we can open the space again. One of the things that I think is of interest in this project is a reference to what the craft theorist David Pye refers to as the workmanship of risk versus the workmanship of certainty. So the workmanship of certainty is familiar to architects. It's usually what we deal with in the architectural world. We draw something on a computer, model it, it gets built exactly as drawn, and there's very little change between conception and completion. The workmanship of risk, on the other hand, introduces uncertainty into the process. This would be like a wood carver or some traditional fabrication technique where the difference between one iteration and the next might be fairly noticeable, as of in the workmanship of certainty, exemplified by mass production. One rarely sees difference between one shoe and the next shoe. So in this project, we wanted to think about both of those ways of conceiving of craft and addressing that in the same project. So fact often begins with large-scale models. These half-inch scale models are actually ways of designing at a scale where one can get into a high level of detail and start to build things the way they're really to be built. And then we start doing one-to-one mock-ups and move on to fabrication. In this case, we split the project into numerous phases in order to accommodate the complexity and scale of the project, and also to work with budget years, so that some work was done in 2019 and other work was done in 2020. So here the students are working again with fairly low resolution material and bringing that together in a way. We call this the curtain wall, which is a sort of an acoustic baffle at the edge of the venue with a seating surface, that sort of this little VIP area, they call it. But then again, questioning aspects of conventional architectural taste. It's not very often that you hear people talk about wallpaper in the conventional architecture, modern studio, and contemporary architecture, but we've been very interested in trying to collage and mix different ways of thinking about aesthetics within the same project. The stage here was conceived as a focal point for the artist, in some ways a halo for the artist, and sort of playing off the notion of the rock star as God, and creating the actual halo for the rock star. Not really what this place is about, but it was a way to start to think about how this would work. I should note that the stage is only about 6 inches above the floor because the ceiling is only 8'4", so we have very little room to work with. This is by no means an ideal space for acoustic performance, but we did what we could with what we had and created a sense of an otherworldly environment within the basement of a former dry goods warehouse. So the stage is actually conceived of and built as an anamorphic perspective. So there's one ideal resolution point where one can see the stage resolve itself as a more or less perfect circle. It didn't quite come out perfectly, but this was done through a high degree of control with a Rhino model and laser sites to locate things in place, and then components offsite fabricated on a CNC router and installed in components, with a hidden door in the back behind the guitar there, and a number of interesting details for lighting and fire sprinklers. So here we have, again, in David Pye's terms, the workmanship of certainty played out in a high degree of control. But then this other element in the space we call the monolith exemplifies the idea of workmanship of risk, but in fact began its life as a parametric model as well. So this object called the monolith is really a wrapping of a mechanical room right in the very middle of the performance space that couldn't be moved for budget reasons. It's actually serving the upper floors of the building. So we had to keep this, we had to deal with it, we had to address acoustic issues from the mechanical equipment itself, but also the acoustic effect that this object would have within the space. So baffling it on the exterior, creating layers of insulation, acoustic insulation was really critical, and then allowing it to absorb sound. So the bottom is an upholstered seating element, which is very popular for patrons, and then the top began as a way to break up various frequencies. The larger holes deal with bigger frequencies. This was digitally fabricated in sheets of plywood, installed, and then plastered with acoustic plaster shot out of a gun by an artist, and with very little direction from us except just to make it crazy and wacky. And as you can see, it's just got stalactites. It's just a goopy mess, painted pink. So obviously this is the workmanship of risk at a very high degree, with underlying control. So I think for us, it was a really interesting opportunity to try to work with these radically different understandings of the way we craft architecture, and to allow a tremendous amount of uncertainty into the process, not only through the techniques used, but the people engaged in the process. Having artists work on the project is a big part of that. The next project I want to show is actually a separate project, but we've later installed it in the Bemis Center. It's going to be part of phase 2, which is a bar, pre-event space for the low-end performance area. It's called Flock. And here we are interested in a high degree of control, like very much higher than, say, the monolith, but still using that control to yield a low resolution surface, contrary to what one might expect from digital design and fabrication. This project goes back to a very early project, Min-Day project. It's actually a cabin that I designed for my parents for an island in Maine. And it was intended to be offsite fabricated. There's no power on the island, and then delivered to the island by helicopter, which is actually the most affordable way, in parts, and assembled on site. It's a bit of a cliche construction system of the sort of finger jointed plywood, a grid forming a complex curved surface. This is from 2002. I was very excited when Praxis Journal, which is a very important journal at the time, decided to publish this, and they asked Greg Lynn to write a review of it. I thought that would be great. Greg Lynn is an important architect, at least in the computation world. But unfortunately, Greg Lynn kind of panned the project and claimed that all I've produced is chunky smoothness, which he believed is a cardinal sin, and claimed I don't know calculus, which is somewhat true. But in resolution here, this project is really, again, an exhibition of this notion of the conflict existing between getting something right and getting it done. But in this point, trying to actually embrace the chunkiness of the project and the looseness, and allowing that imprecision between the computational model and the fabrication of the project to be an improvement upon, or seen as an improvement upon, the original. So Flock actually began itself as a commission for a multi-faith chapel in a historic building at Santa Clara University in California, in an old mission building. It's a historically listed building. We were not allowed to touch any of the structure of the building, not change any surfaces. So this had to be a freestanding interior space built within the walls of the existing space. we conceived it's a multi-faith chapel. It's a Catholic university, but we conceived this as a space, as it was intended for students of all faiths or interests to use as a meeting area. So there's some subtle hints in the space. The sort of rotation of the ellipse above the rectangle is a way to signal the direction to Mecca. So Muslim students would know where they're praying. They know the direction of prayer in the space. For others, it would just be, you know, an unexpected space of certain kind of resolution. But geometrically, that sort of translation of the rectangle to the ellipse created a lot of interesting challenges. Three-dimensionally, it's kind of an interesting surface, but construction-wise, very complex. We conceived this ultimately as a way of exploring a kind of post-tensioned wood construction where we have a steel member at the base that is a ring that wraps around the room, and then a steel ring at the top that is almost complete. The two rings are connected by cables. The wood elements are stacked around those cables, and then the top plate is compressed by tightening the cables to compress the whole piece into a rigid assembly without using any fasteners or any glue of any kind. This project got canceled for reasons that have nothing to do with our design, but changing priorities at the university for the building. But we were very interested in exploring this, so we got a grant and an invitation to do an installation in a gallery in Omaha that was right across from our office. And so we built a small 10-foot by 10-foot version of the piece, seen here in this sort of oddly shaped gallery. So the dimensions really were based on the available space in the gallery. We started with this 10-foot cube, 7-foot circle centered above that, stringing 37 airplane cables between those to create the sort of rolled surfaces of this sort of conical shape, rotating it 30 degrees to create an additional kind of visual tension, but also a structural tension that was helpful. And then, as you can see in the end, the twist starts to give this a pretty dynamic effect of the translation of the square to the circle, but doing that entirely with standard construction material. The opening is just a gap between pieces, and there you see the ultimate piece. So ultimately, we designed this as in a grasshopper script to try to determine the various lengths of the pieces. And so here, to achieve high resolution, there would need to be very many unique pieces to allow a gradual transition of form. The fewer pieces, the lower the resolution, but the easier the assembly and the fabrication. And we settled on this notion of 10 different dimensions, and then a modifier, a thing we call a twig, which is an extension off the piece that has no structural sort of function, but is visibly manifest within the interior. So that's the grasshopper script. The sort of adjustment of board length and quantity here gave us this apparent optimization. The piece has, the construction has 72 layers. There's about 2,500 pieces of 2x6 lumber. Each color represents a different length. And I'm skipping through here, but as you can see, that as the pieces get smaller and start to come together, they form a near circle. So in order to build this, because the cables obviously don't function in tension without the compression of the wood members, but the piece can't be assembled without the cables in place, we came up with a kind of medieval falsework, or Renaissance falsework, I guess, a method used for centering of arches and domes, and created this scaffold on the interior that would hold up the steel ring at the top, allow us to stretch the cables, and then to stack the wood elements until they reach the top. Then the scaffold can be removed. It's bolted to the top ring. It can be unbolted and taken apart, and then that's the end of the piece. So this short video, I'm going to skip through it a little bit. We'll show how this goes together. So this is the installation of the scaffold with the steel ring. And then the cables start to come in. wood members going on. So each wood piece has a slot at either end, so it can be slipped in between the cables. The cables get closer as they reach the top, and the wood boards get smaller so that they still fit. The important thing here is following the map and getting the right piece in the right place. And then as it reaches the top, it starts to come together and the scaffold is taken out, and there we have the final piece. So in the interior, these twigs start to have a visual impact. They sort of, we call it flocks. It's like a flock of birds flying through the space. There's more twigs at the top than at the bottom, so it starts to change as it moves towards the top of the piece. And as I mentioned, this was a gallery installation that is now permanently installed at the Bemis low end as a sort of subspace within that. So at a larger scale, we've been exploring an interest in how cultural projects can become vehicles for positive social change and thinking about community-oriented buildings as ways of building community. I'm going to show 3 projects, the first of which is the Artist Lofts on Lake Street. This is a collaboration with So Ill, an actual architecture company. The project's currently in fundraising, and hopefully we'll start moving on to the next phase in the near future. You know, following our interest at the Bemis of creating social spaces that are activated by architecture and events, we're very interested here in the connection between the craft, this is a space for artists, and their connection to their community, and thinking about the intimacy of those relationships. This is in North Omaha, historically African-American neighborhood. As you can see, there are a lot of vacant lots, evidenced by all the grassy spaces. And this project exists adjacent to a new contemporary arts center and is sort of partially sponsored by the Arts Center and a local nonprofit developer. We began with a series of public workshops on the site itself, and working with you know, a series of stakeholders, artists, and local community members who joined us for charrettes to try to help us understand the relationship of workspace and dwelling space. And then the building itself, or pair of buildings here, becomes a gradient between public open space, private open space, and private interior space, and then also public interior spaces. The low building to the right of our 2 new buildings is a historic jazz club, very famous, and it'll become restored and integrated into the project. And then on the left, the historic brick building is a former telephone exchange that was at a time the home for the Great Plains Black History Museum. The building is in terrible shape now, and hopefully we can restore that as part of the project and bring the Great Plains Black History Museum back to the project. So here we worked with a 10-foot grid, sort of optimized for cross-laminated timber construction, so that each panel could span the width and then the length of each bay within the building. At the ground floor, there's a lot of connectivity between the adjacent buildings and the outdoor spaces. And then as one moves up, the floors alternate between studio floors, exemplified here by the building on the right, and apartment floors on the building on the left. The artists in our stakeholder groups really preferred to maintain a separation between work and live spaces. So as you kind of move up, one building is taller than the other. The notion here is really thinking about the building as a scaffold to mix activities, alternating these living and dwelling floors. So again, as I mentioned, it's cross-laminated timber construction with an exoskeleton of oak glulam beams that can be out of doors, so they're outside the envelope of the building. Decks of metal mesh or grating screens of metal mesh that start to provide a sense of translucency to this in-between space. So all the artists have outdoor decks. And then this public realm within and upon the buildings. So the idea is to create as much translucency and indoor-outdoor connectivity as possible between the various buildings on this cultural campus. So private workspaces and then a public outdoor space between, creating a really productive living and community building for this evolving neighborhood. And as I mentioned, this project is in fundraising, and we're hoping that in the next year or two, we can start to move into design development and then construction. The next project is an ongoing project that began as a fact studio project, and now the office actual architecture company is completing construction drawings, and it's in construction. They're doing demolition right now. This is, was thought of as a design build project, but it's on the far side of Nebraska, and very difficult for us to get students out there, especially during this condition where we can't work in person. But this is part of the grocery is the first public venue for the Sandhills Institute, which was started by the artist Mel Ziegler, who's well known as a social practice artist. He teaches at Vanderbilt, so not far from you. And it's like the Bemis. It's a residency, but artists come to this small town of Rushville in the ranching community in northwest Nebraska, and they work directly with the community of ranchers and farmers to create projects. And none of the projects that the artists create are done on their own in the studio. They're always done in conjunction with people in the community as a way of trying to tie the community together. It's a very unique landscape. It's on the edge of the Nebraska Sandhills, which is incredible place to visit if you happen to be heading up that way. It's not too far from the Black Hills in South Dakota or Mount Rushmore, so if you were going there, try to stop by here. It's a ranching community where culture takes some interesting forms. Bale racing, fun thing to do. I wouldn't get in the way of that. But in terms of architecture, this is a historic early grocery store from the 1950s. The sort of low brick building with a new construction tower, and the tower would contain the artists' live spaces. And one of the things that inspired us to think about how to design this project was working with the American art movement precisionism, and exemplified by Charles Sheeler, and thinking about how one can abstract an architecture without creating a sense of disconnect between the audience and the work. So here's an example of what we mean when we talk about this. This is a photograph that Sheeler took, and then a painting that Sheeler did from the photograph. And what's notable here is the sort of removal of detail, the gradual sort of taking away of elements of the construction and craft of the industrial elements to create something that's semi-abstract but still legible. And that's what we're trying to do with the architecture, to take what's there, leave certain elements, change others, and to confuse in a way the historic record. I don't think preservationists like that, but we're interested here in trying to manipulate an understanding of what is historic and what is contemporary, and letting that be vague. So we also have a landscape design for this. These images were created before the landscape was resolved, but it's an indoor-outdoor venue. The main open space could be for public events or lectures. The tower, as I mentioned, is each level is a small artist's apartment. And then the interior of that is kitchen, restrooms, small office, and storage, really focusing on the public realm, which could be used as a community center and also a space for exhibitions and events. This project won a PA award in 2019, which obviously was a great thing for the project, and we got the image of the model on the cover. But what really helped fundraising and scheduling. The original idea was to phase this project over a few years based on a slow fundraising schedule. But by doing this, by winning this award, we were able to finalize the budget very quickly and start to conceive a single year construction process. So that got delayed because of COVID, but we'll be building it next summer. The final project I want to show is the Blue Barn Theater, completed in end of 2015 in Omaha, Nebraska, not far from where our office is right now. And this building is, again, an example of a highly community-based project, and it's in fact 3 different projects. It sits between the old market where my office is, a residential community to the south, the Missouri River to the east, and then downtown Omaha to the northwest. So there's 3 projects in one here. There's the Blue Barn Theater itself, which is the impetus for this. There is a private development called Boxcar 10, which is a mixed-use building. And then there's a public outdoor space, originally called Green in the City. The 3 come together to form a sort of cohesive yet differentiated experience of urban space. And for us as architects, it's an example of thinking about, again, this sort of intersection of the abstraction of art spaces and the explicit nature of experience of the city. So the white cube is an example of this kind of notion, originally published in Art Form in 1976. Brian O'Doherty wrote Inside the White Cube, The Ideology of Gallery Space, coined this term, the white cube. And he succinctly traces the development of the ubiquitous modern form of the neutral white gallery from its roots in easel painting in the frame, the notion of separating the artwork from the world. And then the equivalent to that in the theater world is the black box, which was created or conceived in the 50s conceptually and really became popular in the 1960s on numerous college campuses. Peter Brook, who conceived the notion, didn't really conceive the idea of the black neutrality, but conceived the idea that a theater work doesn't need a glamorous theater space. It really just needs a text, an actor, and an audience. And so, whereas he was fascinated with the particular properties of spaces and that they're in unique character, a lot of directors started to think of what he was talking about as the equivalent of neutrality, trying to create a void within which the theater work occurs, completely detached from any sense of an exterior or a city or a context of any kind. Our theater consultant, Joshua Dax of Fisher Dax, which is a very well-known international theater consultancy, argued that this sort of notion of neutrality is contradictory in that, obviously, just like the white cube has its own ideology, the black room of the black box is anything but neutral. And so for us, the notion of this project began around trying to understand how one can create a kind of flexibility without neutrality. The idea that we like the flexibility of the black box, the ability to stage different configurations of theater productions, but we don't like its neutrality and blankness. So we conceive the project here as this void of a theater removed to create this box, which became Boxcar 10, the apartment building next door. These actually have separate owners, but the projects were designed together with the same design team. And then surrounding concentrically that theater performance venue with sort of a back of house space, a public realm in blue, and then applying a sort of very straightforward conception of a roof form that follows the programmatic requirements of the theater and the necessity for roof drainage, and allowing that to inflect the form. And then in working with the designers of the garden, conceiving that roof as something that's pushed down to the ground as topography. So when we were hired to design these 2 buildings and then work on this outdoor space, we actually argued that the space would achieve more diversity as an urban place if other voices were involved in the process. And so we argued to hold an international design competition for the garden to create this unique outdoor space for Omaha. And we did a 2-stage competition, started with 50 entries, went down to 5 that were paid a stipend, and ultimately the winner was El Dorado, Inc. with Urban Rain Design, which is a landscape architecture practice. We conceived of rainwater harvesting and a number of other features to try to demonstrate a kind of urban ecological approach to the building. But most importantly, the building is really an attempt at sort of bringing the black box to the exterior. So here you can see the roof. I'm going to talk a little bit about the plan in a minute, and then the apartments of Boxcar 10. And then the exterior from the west, where you can see the theater, the doorways where it opens up. The normally sort of blankness of theater buildings starts to sort of express itself on the street with these very large openings. And then we came up with a really unique cladding system to try to create a sense of overt materiality and challenging the typical American approach to building construction, which privileges products over materials. So products you might purchase out of a catalog or from a vendor instead of materials that are fabricated and custom built. So in a sense, the architectural process in North America anyway is really a kind of shopping where you shop for specified materials that have assembly rules and warranties and so on. But there's very little customization occurring in that. And so to counter to this, we came up with a building envelope that used a Corten steel cladding system so we could get warranties for the cladding of the building, but then suspended weldable rebar in the face of that with light fixtures behind it to create an effect on the surface that started to give the building surface some depth and translucency in a sense, despite the fact that it's essentially an opaque building. Certain times of year, this is the north elevation of the building, the sun starts to skirt around at an angle and create some really unique shadow conditions on the building. And there are moments when one can start to get behind the space. But the other factor in this building was the integration of artists into the design process of the building itself. So unlike the notion of like a 1% for art program where a certain percentage of a public building's budget must go to artists, usually that means artists are commissioned to do pieces that are installed in the building after the fact. We had no mandate. This is a private nonprofit, but we believe that bringing artists in and having them work on the building was a way to start to make the building a living example or a living sort of replication of the way the theater actually works. Like they had built their previous space using former set materials as interior surfaces. So, for an architect to relinquish control can be kind of risky at times, but we feel that in this case, it was quite successful. So we hired 4 artists specifically to work on our design team and ultimately giving them each an area to work with and collaborate with us and the contractor. But many other artists have been commissioned after that time, after the end of construction, to do various different things within the space. So the artwork, I mean, this is an example, Michael Morgan's brickwork. It's a good example of David Pye's workmanship of risk, where this local clay is fired and takes on these really unique forms. So he worked within this vestibule area. Other artists worked around the building in various different ways, working with us, but we were not dictating ultimately what they would do, but trying to work with them to accommodate their own work patterns and practices within the nature of the building itself. Daniel Tober salvaged all the heavy timbers used in the building. These were all salvaged from trees that had been fallen by windstorms or disease or other things around the city of Omaha, and then milled at his shop and then brought in whatever form they're in inside the building itself. So the building is, as I mentioned, is sort of the form of the building is dictated in some ways by the needs of the program, the taller spaces being in the theater itself. There's no fly space in this theater, but a grid at 14 feet above the stage. And then a desire to open up all aspects of the building. So the front of the building opens up to the street, the back opens up into this green space. And then to allow the building to start to inhabit its environment in very unique ways. So we start with a proscenium stage, or sort of basics, fixed seating and stage, but then allow that to open up into what we call the porch yard, and allowing the company to stage a variety of different performances in different configurations. And they've done almost everything that we've depicted here. So here's the house. The seating is salvaged from the previous Blue Barn Theater, which was a warehouse building that they'd inhabited, and that was in turn salvaged from another theater in town. So our conception of this space really begins with the idea of the proscenium as a separation between the house and the stage. The black box gets rid of that and creates a single unique space. We then started to say, well, instead of getting rid of the frame, let's create multiple frames, spread those out through the space, and allow that sense of the proscenium to occupy different realms, so that the performance could be on the stage, could be in the audience, could be in the porch yard, or outside in the green space. Sort of technical aspects of the theater are all met with the grid able to hold quite a bit of weight and allow set materials to be installed, and so on. But then the big moment here is the door that opens up to the landscape. This is an example where commissioning an artist really worked to the benefit of the theater. The contractor was trying to tell us it would cost $120,000 to build these doors through their normal procurement process. We then, this was an artist we added later in the process, we then went and found an artist who was really a brilliant sort of mechanical engineer, and asked him, and he said, I'll do it for $12,000. But we ended up giving him 25 in order to make sure he had enough budget to cover his costs. But stripping away, you know, liabilities that and profit margins, contractor overhead, the general contractor just had to produce an opening with structure capable of holding these doors. But these are 12 feet tall. Each panel is 7 feet wide, and the hinges are all custom milled in a shop. And it allows a performance to then open up to the green space. So the theater is no longer a neutral space, but it's one where the noises of the city, trucks driving by to the local post office, or cars, or dogs barking, trains going by, are all going to become part of the experience of the performance. When the doors are open, when they're shut, it can start to act in a more conventional fashion. So this project is really a culmination of interests in the firm, interested in bespoke projects, but loose and improvisational building processes at the same time. In this case, it's a new building that keeps the identity and culture of the institution of the Blue Barn intact, while projecting an exciting future for the theater. And for us, it's asking the question, which form of craft is appropriate for this project, but then answering many and all. Let them play off each other, let them overlap to create frictions that cause the regular user and the occasional patron to question their surroundings. So in summary, it's not a matter of which craft paradigm to choose, but how craftsmanship of various forms and levels of technological advancement with the selection of the correct tools merge in an ad hoc but situationally appropriate manner to meet the needs of the project. At some point in this process, computation, procedural modeling, algorithmic workflows, and digital fabrication, when appropriate, need to be paired with non-computational techniques as projects encounter external constraints such as sites and adjacent materials. So with that, I will wrap up here, and I think if there are any questions, we will kind of go there. So I'm going to stop the share here, and I think Ted is going to appear miraculously at some point.
Great, thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Yes, and we do have a little time for questions. I'll remind everyone that the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen is that's the method through which to send questions. We have a couple here in the queue, so we'll start with those, Jeff. The first comes from Jason Young, and he asks, much of what you presented speaks to the making of institutions through great design and compelling craft. Have you thought explicitly about the witchcraft in terms related to how institutions are crafted or made?
That's a great question. I mean, as an academic, I definitely think about that very much, and certainly, you know, on the ACSA board, we don't craft institutions, but we advise institutions, I guess. And But I think with the Blue Barn Theater in particular is an example from practice where the institution itself is trying to craft a very sort of narrow understanding of its, a nuanced understanding of its relationship to the community. We have a theater that was sort of started by some sort of New York expatriates who'd left New York theater world, came out to the Midwest, started a theater in a warehouse, and tried to reconceive the relationship of the theater to the community. And they have a very loyal following. As I mentioned, they were previously located in an old warehouse building, and then they were going to build this new building that would give them opportunities to expand their performance capabilities technically, and also in terms of a slight increase in audience size. But they had a really difficult time finding an architect who understood the scrappiness of the institution and how that could be translated into an architectural space that would evolve with the institution. We were actually the third architect hired by the Blue Barn. The first one was a local firm that didn't get very far. They then hired Studio Gang, and we're working with Studio Gang through schematic design, and parted ways over, again, differences of understanding of the relationship of the institution to its community. And then we came on board after that. The advantage for us of having they went through that process was they really knew what they wanted, and they knew architects were a bunch of jerks. And so we had to sort of negotiate some difficult feelings. But ultimately, their thought process had evolved through these sort of engagements with specifically Studio Gang. And I think our building looks nothing like what Studio Gang was doing, but programmatically, I guess there is some similarities in terms of sizes of spaces and so on. But I think that the idea of how an architecture can resolve in construction of an institution, I think, is really important. And I think the other two projects I showed before that also, I won't get into we don't have time to kind of go on and on about it, but the grocery, started by Mel Ziegler as a way to engage artists with a really conservative rural community that, doesn't probably vote the way he does, and have some views that you may not want to talk about, but they are people, and they are very committed to their landscape. And his place is really about, his institution is about trying to, foment dialogue and let people kind of come together over, as he says, pie and coffee and hang out. And then Artist Lofts, again, is another example of a new kind of institution that is very much about the community. And the story behind that project, I think, came to a point where there was a concern that artists coming into a poor Black neighborhood is going to mean gentrification and all of the negativity that comes with that. But a sort of mantra that came out of the project from one of the stakeholders was the idea that people don't have to be from the neighborhood necessarily to use this building, but they have to be for the neighborhood, and they have to really sort of think about their inhabitation of this building as an artist is not, hey, it's cheap rent. It's not about that. It's really about opening up a relationship between an art practice and a community through an institution. So.
Great. So we have a second question here. This one's from Tricia. It appears your design work entails the deliberate construction of relationships and orchestration of their various contributions. Can you speak to the expanded roles of work that you do as an architect, and how and why you do this as a practitioner and as a faculty member?
Wow. All in like 5 words, right? It's a great question. I think, the fact that I teach and practice is critical to the way I think about, my career. And I couldn't imagine being in one world or the other, but I think the relationship between the sort of critical practice of teaching and working with students and the sometimes very pragmatic world of professional practice where, a client has a need and a budget and a site and a schedule, and, you got to meet them all. I think the critical world of the studio in school allows us to maybe to think differently about how we practice. We're not we tend not to work on conventional sort of developer projects or projects where there's no interest in sort of questioning the way we're putting things together or doing things. But on the other hand, I think the professional side influences the design build studio, in that one of the things I really try to get across to the students is that practice always engages with a kind of uncertainty. And so, COVID is a great example. We were building actively in March at the Bemis Center, and suddenly the university shut down. We were no longer able to be on site, and we had to come up with new ways of interacting, but still keeping the project moving. So there was an artist who was working with us who kept working on site by himself, and the students would engage with him on Zoom and kind of invent a process. I could kind of go on and on about this, but I think that it's a great question.
And I should mention that a couple of thank yous have come through in the questions as well, including one from Scott Poole, just saying thank you for the beauty of your work and the clarity of your presentation. So I'll frame one last question here because it looks like we're getting close to 8 o'clock, but it's a bit of a follow-on question from Trisha's. And you're talking about a kind of a philosophical framing that is coming from, at least largely from Senate, and a kind of a workflow that takes architectural ideas and architectural intent, and it carries those through material means, and then those are modified by a hand or a tool that may or may not be your own. And so there's a lot interacting there, and a lot of knowledge that you have to lay the foundation for that. So how do you begin to frame all that for students and give them the way of thinking about and the knowledge necessary to work in those different realms?
Yeah, that's a challenge, because often in this, specifically in the design build studios, the schedule is very tight, and obviously we're constrained by the academic year. But when I was the director of our program, one of the things I did was work with the faculty to reconceive our master's program so that it would be possible for a faculty member to schedule a year-long studio or even a 2-year-long studio that had an influx and outflux of students, so that we could take bigger scale longer term projects, and work on them with changing continuities of personalities. And so that's one way to sort of stretch it out, which allows us to have moments of sort of reflection built within that. So, I mean, I conceive this lecture not before I create the projects, but I look at our work and I think, okay, what do I want to talk about here? I have, in the past, I've done lectures about some of the same projects on very different sort of thematic, because there's so many different aspects of the work. It's not all about craft. I mean, that's not the only thing I ever talk about. So I think with the students, what we try to do is build in moments of reflection in the semester. It starts usually with before they even start anything, writing a reflection paper or a preview paper about the context of the studio, or even just their thoughts about doing a design build studio if they've never done it. And then we do a follow-up to that in the middle of the semester, and then something at the end where even though the project might still be going on, the students are kind of bringing to their phase of involvement to a close, and they write something again. And then those become discussed as part of a seminar context. So I think it's really, the important thing is to kind of pull the students out of the pragmatic world of making things every so often and help them reflect on that, so that they're not just sort of laser focused on their component of the project.
And so is that seminar a separate course, or is that baked into the? It's
baked into the course. So, if I had more flexibility as a teacher, I probably would want to have a seminar that was associated with it and have the students, both in the studio and the seminar. But we're not a very big program. It's kind of hard to do that and get that to work with other faculty and their agendas as well. So I try to bake it all into the same experience. And it would be maybe better and if it was expanded into a separate sort of credit hour generating vehicle, so the students could spend more time on the reflection side. But at the very least, they have some engagement with that. And I try to bring them back occasionally to, even after they graduate, to come through the studio or through the projects. And the staff in my office, half of them have been in the studio before. So.
Great. And we will do one more question here. One more came in while we were talking. This is from Josie Tunnel. And through working with various artists using various mediums, as well as design students in various ways of doing things, do you feel as a teacher and architect that your personal design process and skills have changed throughout your career?
Definitely. I think, I tend to be pretty heavy-handed sometimes if I'm on my own designing things. And I think, working with students means, I've got 12 students in my studio right now. There's like ideas flying all over the place. And, it's hard to be a heavy-handed architect if you've got that many sort of voices in the room. So I think it really helps me loosen up. So I started the lecture with the images of that Okoboji house. That's kind of what I used to think I wanted to do, is like, super tight, everything perfected, detailing. And I think ended with the Blue Barn where, it's a pretty loose building and it's not at all what we would have conceived, in a charrette, say, or a competition design. It could only really have evolved out of the process of working with a, very sort of dynamic client, but also with all these artists. And the design build work kind of has that built into the fact that the design team is usually a lot bigger than it would be in a conventional architectural project. So I think, I could probably go through and parse through projects and talk about their stories, but that's maybe for another time.
Very good. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and good evening, and everybody stay safe.
All right. Thanks everybody. It's good to not see you, but I wish I